The Bronze Age was a world more interconnected than most people realize. During the late Bronze Age, roughly between 1500 and 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East functioned almost like a single vast economic zone. The great civilizations of this era, Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, New Kingdom Egypt, Assyria, and the prosperous Canaanite city-states weren't isolated kingdoms existing in their own bubbles. They were bound together through elaborate networks of trade, diplomacy, and, yes, warfare. Royal correspondents traveled between courts. Merchant ships crossed the Mediterranean, carrying goods that no single region could produce alone. Diplomatic marriages sealed alliances. It was, in many ways, the first truly globalized world, and that interconnection was both their greatest strength and their fatal weakness. You see, bronze technology, the very foundation of this age, required something that almost no single civilization possessed in abundance, both tin and copper. Bronze is an alloy, a mixture of these two metals, and while copper could be found in several regions, tin was rare and had to be imported from distant sources, possibly as far away as Afghanistan or Cornwall in Britain. This meant that the great powers of the Bronze Age depended entirely on long-distance trade routes that stretched thousands of miles. The economy wasn't just interconnected, it was fragile. When one region destabilized, the effects rippled outward like cracks spreading across thin ice. If the tin supply was cut off, armies couldn't equip their soldiers. If trade routes were disrupted, economies faltered. The entire system relied on stability, and stability, as we'll see, was about to shatter. Around 1200 BCE, something began to go wrong. The first signs weren't dramatic, no single catastrophic event announced the coming collapse. Instead, trade routes across the Mediterranean and Near East began to break down, slowly at first, then with increasing severity. Ships stopped arriving at ports. Caravans failed to reach their destinations. The reasons are still debated by historians: piracy, warfare, climate change, political instability, but the effect was undeniable. The flow of goods that had sustained Bronze Age civilization for centuries was drying up, and when that happened, shortages followed. Tin, that crucial ingredient for bronze production, became increasingly scarce. Without tin, you couldn't make bronze. Without bronze, you couldn't make weapons, tools, or the prestige items that marked power and status. Armies weakened. Economies contracted. Luxury goods, fine bronze weapons, elaborate pottery, imported textiles, and oils became rare or disappeared entirely. The very things that marked a civilization as prosperous and powerful were slipping away. States that had built their entire systems around centralized palace redistribution, where the king's palace collected resources and redistributed them to the population, were especially vulnerable. When the trade stopped, the palaces had nothing to redistribute. The system began to fail. Let's look at what happened in Mycenaean Greece, because their collapse tells us just how quickly and completely a civilization could fall apart. Asterisk. Mycenaean Greece, the Greece of the legendary heroes, of Agamemnon and Achilles, of the Trojan War, if it happened at all, was organized around massive palace centers. Places like Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes weren't just royal residences. They were the beating heart of Mycenaean civilization. Everything flowed through these palaces. They controlled politics and religion. They managed food storage in vast warehouses. They organized labor, telling farmers when to plant and craftsmen what to produce. The palaces ran workshops where specialized artisans created pottery, weapons, textiles, and luxury goods. In other words, Mycenaean society depended almost entirely on this palace economy. If you were a Mycenaean Greek, the palace wasn't just where the king lived, it was the institution that fed you, employed you, and gave structure to your entire world. Then, Around 1200 BCE, most of these palaces were destroyed or abandoned within a relatively short period. The archaeological evidence is stark. At site after site, excavators have found thick burn layers, charred beams, collapsed walls, destroyed storerooms. The destruction wasn't neat or organized. It was violent, whether from internal revolt, external invasion, earthquake, or some combination of factors. The result was the same. The centers of Mycenaean power were gone, and when the palaces fell, the entire centralized political system collapsed with them. Power didn't transfer to some other institution, it simply fragmented. What had been a unified kingdom or confederation broke apart into local rule, with no central authority to coordinate defense, trade, or food distribution. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Food shortages spread across the Greek mainland. Without the palace system to manage agricultural surplus and redistribute it during lean times, communities were on their own. Economic collapse followed close behind. The elaborate craft specialization that had existed under palace patronage, the master potters, the skilled bronzesmiths, the textile workers, all of this declined sharply or disappeared entirely. These artisans had worked for the palaces, creating goods for trade and for the elite. Without palace support, there was no one to pay them, no one to organize their work. The sophisticated artistic traditions of Mycenaean Greece faded. Trade with the outside world sharply declined. Mycenaean pottery, which had been exported throughout the Mediterranean, stopped appearing in foreign sites. The connections with Egypt, with Anatolia, with the Near East, all of those relationships that had enriched Mycenaean culture withered away. And the people themselves. Population levels dropped dramatically. The large palace centers that had supported thousands were abandoned. People moved to small, defensible villages in the hills, often in locations chosen for protection rather than agricultural productivity. It was a retreat, a withdrawal from the connected, prosperous world of the late Bronze Age into isolated, impoverished communities just trying to survive within perhaps a generation or two. Mycenaean Greece had fallen from a literate, wealthy, powerful civilization into what we now call the Greek Dark Ages, a period where writing disappeared, where artistic traditions were lost, where even the memory of the great palaces faded into legend. That's how fast it happened. That's how completely a civilization could collapse when the systems holding it together failed. And Mycenaean Greece was just the beginning, the collapse of the Mycenaean. Palaces didn't just mean the end of political power or economic prosperity. It meant the loss of something we often take for granted, the written word itself. Linear B was the writing system of Mycenaean Greece. It was an early form of Greek, written in a syllabic script that had been adapted from the earlier Minoan linear, but here's the thing about Linear B, it wasn't used for literature. For poetry, for letters between friends, or even for historical records. It was purely administrative. The clay tablets we've recovered are inventories, tax records, lists of livestock, grain stores, textile production quotas. They're bureaucratic documents that tell us how many sheep a particular shepherd was responsible for, or how much bronze was allocated to a weapons workshop. Linear B existed to serve the palace economy, to track and control the resources that flowed through those centralized systems. So when the palaces collapsed, when those administrative centers burned or were abandoned, Linear B disappeared completely. There was no reason to maintain it. The scribes who had been trained to write it were palace functionaries, and without palaces, there were no functionaries. The system that had required written records simply didn't exist anymore. Within a generation, perhaps two, no one in Greece knew how to read or write. The skill was lost, writing vanished from Greece for several centuries, roughly, from 1200 BCE until around 800 BCE, when the Greeks would eventually adopt and adapt the Phoenician alphabet into what became the Greek alphabet we know today. But for those 400 years, Greece was illiterate. Think about what that means. Without writing, there's no way to record history, no way to preserve complex knowledge across generations, no way to maintain long-distance communication or formal diplomatic relations. The sophistication that comes with literacy legal codes, astronomical observations, mathematical records, literature, all of that was gone. This period, unsurprisingly, is what historians call the Greek Dark Age, and the name fits. It's dark, not because the people living through it were somehow less intelligent or capable, but because we have so little evidence from this time. Without written records, we're left with archaeology alone, and what archaeology shows us is a Greece that had become dramatically poorer and simpler. Burial practices are one of the clearest indicators. During the Mycenaean period, elite burials were elaborate affairs. Wealthy individuals were interred in massive tholos tombs, great beehive-shaped structures built of carefully fitted stone. They were buried with gold masks, bronze weapons, jewelry, fine pottery. These burials announced status, wealth, and power even in death. But after the collapse, burial practices became simpler, almost stark by comparison. Grave goods declined sharply. The massive tomb construction stopped. People were buried in simple cis graves or pit burials, often with little more than a clay pot or two. This wasn't just a change in fashion, it showed reduced wealth and a flattening of social hierarchy. The extremes of wealth that had existed when palaces controlled resources had disappeared. The political structure changed fundamentally as well. During the Mycenaean period, rulers were known by the title Wainax, a term that appears repeatedly in linear B tablets and seems to have meant something like king or lord, someone with supreme authority over a palace kingdom. But after the collapse, the Wainax disappeared from Greek society. When writing returned centuries later and we begin to see Greek political structures again, there's no Wainax. Political organization had fragmented into smaller units, and where kings existed at all, they had far less authority than their Bronze Age predecessors. Power had become localized, personal, based more on individual prowess and the ability to command loyalty from a warband than on inherited. Divine kingship backed by palace bureaucracy, and life. For most people, probably became more violent. When centralized states collapse and resources become scarce, warfare tends to increase. Not the organized warfare between kingdoms with formal declarations and diplomatic protocols, but raiding, feuding, competition between neighboring communities for control over limited agricultural land and trade goods. The archaeological record hints at this settlements from this period are often located in defensible positions, on hilltops or in places that are difficult to access. These aren't locations you'd choose if your primary concern was agricultural productivity. You choose them when your primary concern is not being raided and destroyed. The instability, the breakdown of larger political structures, the resource scarcity, all of this created conditions where small-scale warfare became part of the rhythm of life, yet remarkably, not everything was lost. Some cultural traditions survived the collapse, carried forward in oral memory even without writing. Most importantly, the Greek language itself survived. The people of the Dark Age still spoke Greek, a direct continuation of the Mycenaean language preserved in linear B tablets. Certain religious practices, certain myths and legends, certain cultural practices must have been passed down through generations by word of mouth. When Greek civilization re-emerged centuries later, it wasn't starting from scratch. There was continuity even through the darkness. The stories of the Trojan War, of the great heroes, of the old kingdoms, these may well have originated as memories, however distorted, of the Mycenaean age. kept alive through oral poetry during the centuries when no one could write them down. This was the Greek Dark Age, a world where writing was forgotten, where wealth diminished, where political power fragmented, where violence increased, but where somehow through it all, the thread of Greek identity and culture endured, waiting for the chance to flourish again. It would take centuries, but Greece would recover. For now, though, the darkness had settled in, and it wasn't just Greece that was suffering. The collapse was spreading, and other great civilizations were about to face their own reckonings. If the collapse of Mycenaean Greece was gradual, unfolding over decades as palace after palace fell, the disappearance of the Hittite Empire was startlingly abrupt. One moment, you have one of the great powers of the Bronze Age world. The next, it's simply gone. The Hittite Empire was centered in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and at its height, it was a superpower. The Hittites had fought the Egyptians to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history. They'd carved out an empire that stretched from the Aegean coast deep into Syria. They controlled crucial trade routes, commanded vast resources, and their diplomatic correspondence shows up in archives from Egypt to Babylon. When the great powers of the late Bronze Age wrote to each other, the Hittite king was always part of that conversation. He was an equal among equals, a player on the world stage, and the physical embodiment of Hittite power was their capital, Hattusa. This wasn't just a city, it was a statement. Hattusa was a massive fortified complex built on rocky terrain in north-central Anatolia, protected by enormous stone walls that stretched for miles. These walls incorporated massive limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, fitted together with impressive precision. Gates were decorated with carved reliefs of lions and sphinx. Inside the walls were temples, palaces, administrative buildings, grain storage facilities, everything needed to run an empire. Hattusa was designed to be impregnable, to project strength and permanence. It was meant to last forever. Around 1200 BCE, Hattusa was abandoned. The archaeological evidence is disturbing. Excavations have revealed burned areas throughout the site, suggesting violent destruction or at the very least significant unrest. Buildings were torched. Storage areas were emptied or destroyed. And then the city was simply left behind. The capital of an empire, a city that had been the center of Hittite civilization for centuries, was deserted. People walked away or fled or were driven out. We don't know exactly what happened. But the result is clear. Hattusa ceased to function as a capital, as a city, as anything dot, and with the loss of the capital, central authority collapsed entirely. An empire is more than just territory. It's a functioning system of administration, of communication, of control. Hattusa was where the king ruled, where the bureaucracy operated, where laws were made and recorded, where taxes were collected and armies were organized. When Hattusa fell, all of that infrastructure vanished. There was no backup capital, no smooth transition of power to another city. The center simply ceased to exist, and without a center, the empire couldn't hold together. We can see this in the written records, or rather in their absence. Hittite cuneiform tablets, which had been produced continuously for centuries, stop abruptly around 1200 BCE. One of the last documents we have is a desperate letter from the final Hittite king, possibly named Suppiluliuma II, addressing some kind of crisis. Then nothing. The administrative record just ends. No more royal decrees, no more diplomatic correspondence, no more legal judgments, no more religious texts, no more inventories. The bureaucratic machinery that had kept the empire running for generations simply shut down. It's as if someone turned off a light switch and everything went dark. And just like in Greece, cuneiform writing, the script the Hittites had used for laws, treaties, religious texts, and administrative documents, disappeared with the state. Writing wasn't something that existed independently in Hittite society. It was a tool of the palace and temple, used by trained scribes who served the government. When the government collapsed, there was no institution left to employ scribes, no reason to train new ones, no audience for written documents. Within a generation, the knowledge of how to read and write cuneiform was lost in Anatolia. Centuries of accumulated written wisdom, legal traditions, historical records, religious knowledge became inaccessible, locked away in clay tablets that no one could read anymore. The economic effects rippled outward immediately. Trade routes that had linked Anatolia to Syria and Mesopotamia were disrupted. The Hittite Empire had been a crucial node in Bronze Age trade networks, controlling access between the Aegean world and the Near East. Merchants had traveled through Hittite territory under the protection of the state, paying taxes but also receiving safe passage. With the empire gone, that security disappeared. Banditry increased. Trade contracted. The goods that had flowed through Anatolia metals, textiles, luxury items stopped moving, or moved in much smaller quantities through much more dangerous routes. But why did it happen? What brought down such a powerful state so quickly? The answer, as with most historical collapses, is that it wasn't just one thing. The Hittite Empire was facing multiple crises simultaneously, each one weakening the state's ability to respond to the others. Internal instability was already a problem before the final collapse. Succession struck directions. Groups of displaced peoples, raiders, migrants, some of whom may have been part of what Egyptian records call the Sea Peoples, were moving through Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean. We'll talk more about the Sea Peoples later, but for now, understand that the Hittites were facing military threats they couldn't fully control. The empire was stretched thin, trying to defend multiple frontiers while also dealing with internal problems. It's a situation no state can sustain indefinitely. Perhaps most tellingly, neighboring states stopped recognizing Hittite authority. In the late Bronze Age, international relations were formalized through treaties, diplomatic correspondence, and mutual recognition among the great powers. But in the final years of the Hittite Empire, we see that recognition eroding. Vassal states stopped paying tribute. Former allies stopped responding to Hittite diplomatic overtures. It's a sign that everyone could see the empire was weakening, and when an empire is perceived as weak, it loses the ability to command respect or obedience. Power in the ancient world wasn't just about military might, it was about reputation, about the belief that you could enforce your will. Once that belief eroded, so did the power itself. GLEs had weakened the empire's unity. The Hittite system of royal succession wasn't always clear, and competing claimants to the throne could tear the kingdom apart. There's evidence of internal revolt and civil conflict in the years leading up to the abandonment of Tusa. When a state is fighting itself, it's vulnerable to everything else, and there was plenty else to be vulnerable to. External pressure was mounting from multiple. The Hittite Empire never recovered as a unified state. There was no Hittite Renaissance, no period of rebuilding and restoration. Small Neo-Hittite kingdoms would eventually emerge in parts of Syria and southeastern Anatolia, preserving some cultural traditions and even some use of Hittite hieroglyphic script. But these were minor regional powers, not the empire that had once rivaled Egypt. The great Hittite state was finished, erased from the political map so completely that, by the classical Greek period, the Hittites were barely remembered. It took modern archaeology to rediscover them and reveal just how powerful they had once been. Think about that for a moment. One of the great empires of the ancient world, a civilization that had existed for half a millennium, vanished so completely that later civilizations barely knew it had existed. Hattusa, that massive fortified capital built to project eternal strength, was abandoned and forgotten, its walls slowly crumbling, its palaces open to the sky, its archives sitting unread in the ruins. That's the scale of collapse we're talking about. Not just political change, not just the replacement of one dynasty with another, but the utter dissolution of a civilization to the point where even its memory faded. And the frightening thing is, it happened so fast. Within a generation, perhaps less. The Hittite Empire went from being a major power to simply not existing anymore. The interconnected world of the late Bronze Age was coming apart at the seams. And the collapse was accelerating. So what happened to Anatolia after the empire fell? What filled the vacuum left by the Hittites? The answer is fragmentation. The vast territory that had once been unified under Hittite rule broke apart into smaller, independent regional kingdoms. There was no successor state, no new empire that rose up to claim the Hittite legacy and restore order. Instead, Anatolia became a patchwork of competing powers, each controlling a relatively small area, none of them possessing anything close to the resources or authority the Hittite Empire had commanded. This fragmentation was the new reality across much of the former Bronze Age world, where there had been large, centralized states capable of projecting power across hundreds of miles. Now there were smaller kingdoms, often based around a single fortified city and its immediate hinterland. These states couldn't maintain the extensive trade networks the great empires had controlled. They couldn't field the massive armies. They couldn't support the same level of bureaucratic administration or artistic production. The scale of political organization had simply shrunk, but the Hittites didn't disappear entirely. In southern Anatolia and northern Syria, a series of Neo-Hittite city-states managed to survive the collapse. These were smaller entity city-states, really. Not kingdoms in the grand sense, but they preserved important elements of Hittite civilization. Hittite religion continued to be practiced in these regions. The gods and goddesses who had been worshipped in Hattusa were still honored in temples. Hittite artistic styles persisted, particularly in stone carving and relief sculpture. You can see the continuity in the way these Neo-Hittite states decorated their buildings and monuments. The style is recognizably Hittite, even if the scale and ambition are reduced. Asterisk. Language, too, survived in modified form. The Neo-Hittite states used a hieroglyphic script different from the cuneiform the imperial Hittites had used for most official documents to write in Luwian, a language closely related to Hittite. So while the cuneiform administrative tradition had died with the empire, writing itself didn't completely disappear from this region. These Neo-Hittite kingdoms maintained literacy and left behind inscriptions that allow us to trace their history for several more centuries. In many ways, these Neo-Hittite city-states were successful on their own terms. They survived, they maintained their cultural identity, they continued to participate in regional trade and politics. Some of them lasted for centuries, well into the Iron Age, until they were eventually absorbed by the expanding Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. That's not insignificance, that's resilience, but we have to be clear about what was lost. Imperial power was gone permanently. The Neo-Hittite states were regional players, not great powers. They didn't command the resources to field massive armies or build monumental capitals like Hattusa. They didn't have the reach to enforce their will across Anatolia or to negotiate as equals with Egypt and Babylon. They couldn't protect the long-distance trade routes or maintain the kind of stable, prosperous peace that had characterized the late Bronze Age at its height. The scale of ambition, the sheer capacity for organization and control that had defined the Hittite Empire that was never recovered, and this is a pattern we see repeated throughout the collapse. The civilizations that fell didn't simply reboot at their previous level of complexity. They fragmented, simplified, localized. When they recovered it all, it was as smaller, more modest entities. The grand imperial systems of the Bronze Age, with their palatial economies and international diplomacy and long-distance trade networks, were replaced by something fundamentally different and, in many ways, fundamentally smaller. Anatolia would eventually see the rise of new powers, the Phrygians, the Lydians, and later the Persians, but none of these directly continued the Hittite imperial tradition. The Hittite Empire was a dead end, an evolutionary branch that didn't lead anywhere. Its collapse was final dot, and this raises an uncomfortable question that applies not just to the Hittites, but to all the civilizations we're discussing. If a society collapses so completely that its imperial structure never returns, was that structure ever truly stable to begin with? Or was it always fragile, held together by contingent factors that could fail at any moment? The Hittite Empire had seemed permanent. Its massive fortifications, its sophisticated bureaucracy, its military power, all of it suggested a state that would endure for generations. And yet, within a single human lifetime, it was gone, reduced to scattered successor states that preserved cultural memories but could never recreate the empire itself. That's perhaps the darkest fact of all about these collapses. They reveal that civilizations we think of as solid and enduring are often far more fragile than they appear. The institutions that seem permanent, the systems that seem unshakable, can fail catastrophically when the conditions that support them change. And once they fail, once that complexity is lost, it's extraordinarily difficult, sometimes impossible, to get it back. The Hittite Empire was gone. Mycenaean Greece was in its dark age, and the collapse was still spreading. Other civilizations were about to face their own moments of reckoning, and for some of them, the crisis was quite literally about to arrive on their shores. Now let's turn to Egypt, because Egypt's story during the Bronze Age collapse is different. In some ways, that difference makes it even more instructive. The New Kingdom was Egypt's most powerful era, its imperial golden age. This was the Egypt of Ramesses II, of massive temple complexes at Karnak and Ebis Symbol, of military campaigns into Syria and Nubia, of wealth and monumental architecture on a scale that still awes us today. New Kingdom Egypt wasn't just a regional power, it was one of the great superpowers of the late Bronze Age world, respected and feared from Mesopotamia to the Aegean. Egyptian gold filled the treasuries of foreign kings. Egyptian military might kept the Levant under control. Egyptian diplomacy shaped international relations across the Eastern Mediterranean dot, and unlike the other states we've discussed, Egypt did not collapse completely during the crisis of 1200 BCE. This is crucial to understand. While Mycenaean Greece fell into illiteracy and poverty, while the Hittite Empire vanished, while chaos spread across the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt survived. The pharaonic state continued to function. Temples still operated. The bureaucracy still recorded information in hieroglyphics. The fundamental structure of Egyptian civilization remained intact, but survival came at a tremendous cost, and Egypt would never be the same. The crisis arrived in the form of repeated invasions from groups Egyptian records call the Sea Peoples. We'll discuss who these Sea Peoples might have been in more detail later, but for now, understand them as waves of displaced peoples raiders, migrants, refugees, warriors moving through the Eastern Mediterranean and attempting to settle or plunder wherever they could. For most states, the Sea Peoples were catastrophic. For Egypt, they were survivable, but only barely, and only through enormous military effort. The pharaoh who faced the worst of these invasions was Ramesses III, around 1177 BCE Egyptian temple. Inscriptions, particularly those at Medinet Habu, record these conflicts in dramatic detail. Ramesses III describes massive battles on land and sea, invasions by coalition forces coming from multiple directions. According to these records, the Sea Peoples had already destroyed the Hittites, devastated Cyprus, and overrun several Levantan cities. Now they were coming for Egypt, and they came in numbers large enough to threaten the very existence of the Egyptian state. Ramesses III repelled them. Egyptian forces fought major battles in the Nile Delta, naval engagements in the Mediterranean, and land campaigns in the Levant. The temple reliefs at Medinet Habu show vivid scenes of these battles, Egyptian archers firing from ships, enemy vessels capsizing, prisoners being led away in chains. Egypt's military, still the most formidable in the region, managed to hold the line. The invaders were defeated, pushed back, prevented from overrunning the Nile Valley. In military terms, it was a success. Egypt had survived where others had fallen, but these wars drained Egypt's treasury catastrophically. Fighting wars on this scale isn't cheap. You need to maintain large standing armies. You need to pay soldiers and provide them with equipment, bronze weapons, chariots, armor. You need to build and maintain fortifications along your borders. You need supply lines to feed and support troops in the field. You need ships for naval warfare. All of this costs enormous amounts of resources, and Egypt was fighting not just one campaign, but multiple invasions over several years. The economic strain became unsustainable. Egypt's wealth had always been substantial, drawn from agricultural surplus in the Nile Valley, from gold mines in Nubia, from trade and tribute. But even Egypt's resources had limits, and the constant military mobilization was pushing those limits to the breaking point. Maintaining the armies and fortifications necessary to defend against continued threats meant diverting resources away. From everything else, from temple construction, from trade expeditions, from the palace economy, from the systems that kept Egyptian society functioning smoothly. And then there was the trade problem. Egypt had been heavily integrated into the Eastern Mediterranean trade network. Egyptian gold and grain were exchanged for timber from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia, tin for bronze production, luxury goods from across the region. But as the Bronze Age world collapsed around Egypt, trade with the Eastern Mediterranean declined sharply. It wasn't that Egypt chose to withdraw from trade. It's that there was no one left to trade with. The Hittites were gone. Mycenaean Greece had collapsed. The Levantan city-states were destroyed or severely weakened. The trade partners Egypt had relied on for centuries simply didn't exist anymore, or existed in such diminished form that they couldn't maintain the old commercial relationships. This meant Egypt's access to luxury goods and resources decreased dramatically. Items that had once flowed freely into Egypt became rare or unavailable. Tin for bronze production became harder to acquire. Cedar wood from Lebanon, essential for construction and shipbuilding, was less accessible. The cosmopolitan luxury that had characterized the new kingdom court began to fade. Egypt was becoming more isolated, more self-contained, cut off from the wider world that had once enriched it. Even grain distribution became harder, despite the Nile's stability. This seems paradoxical at first after all. Egypt's agriculture was based on the predictable annual flooding of the Nile, which wasn't affected by the chaos in the Mediterranean. The Nile still flooded, crops still grew. Egypt still produced agricultural surplus. But producing grain and distributing it efficiently are two different things. The administrative system that managed grain collection, storage, and redistribution was under strain. The temples and palaces that coordinated this distribution were dealing with reduced resources and increased demands. The workers who moved and processed grain needed to be paid, but the treasury was depleted. The whole system was still functioning, but it was functioning badly. With inefficiencies and breakdowns that hadn't existed before, we can see the economic stress in the documents that survive from this period. Records show inflation through rising grain prices. In a stable economy, grain prices remain relatively consistent, predictable based on harvest quality and seasonal variation. But in late New Kingdom Egypt, grain prices were rising dramatically, a clear sign of economic disturbance. When prices rise sharply in an agricultural economy, it means something fundamental is wrong. Either supply is failing, or the currency is devaluing, or distribution systems are breaking down. In Egypt's case, it was likely a combination of all three. The economy that had seemed so stable and prosperous was showing cracks, and then came one of the most remarkable events in ancient history, something that shows just how severe the crisis had become. The workers at Deir al-Medina staged the first recorded labor strike in history. Deir al-Medina was a village of skilled workers, stonemasons, painters, craftsmen who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These weren't peasants or conscript laborers. They were specialists, well paid by ancient standards, essentially state employees who worked directly for the pharaoh. Their wages were paid in rations, grain, oil, other necessities, distributed regularly by the royal administration. It was a system that had worked smoothly for generations, but in the 29th year of Ramesses III's reign, the rations stopped arriving. The workers waited. Days passed. Still no payment. Finally, they did something unprecedented. They walked off the job. They left their work sites, marched to the local temples, and sat down, refusing to return to work until they were paid. "We're hungry," they declared. Not starving hungry. Even these relatively privileged workers were feeling the economic strain. The strike worked, eventually. Authorities scrambled to find grain and paid the workers. But the incident is remarkable not because it succeeded, but because it happened at all. In a society where the pharaoh was considered a living god, where questioning royal authority was nearly unthinkable, workers felt conditions were bad enough that they were willing to risk punishment by refusing to work. And significantly, they weren't punished. The authorities couldn't punish them because the workers were right. The system had failed to deliver what it owed. The state was breaking its implicit contract with its own employees. This is what survival looked like for Egypt. The state didn't collapse. The temples still stood. The pharaoh still ruled. Hieroglyphic writing continued. But the prosperity, the power, the reach that had defined the new kingdom at its height, all of that was diminished. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, but it survived as a weaker, poorer, more isolated version of itself. The new kingdom would limp on for another century or so, before finally fragmenting into the third intermediate period, an era of division and foreign rule. Egypt's survival, in other words, doesn't really contradict the narrative of collapse, it modifies it. Collapse doesn't always mean total destruction. Sometimes it means surviving in a severely weakened state, maintaining the forms of your civilization while losing much of its substance. Egypt kept its writing, its religion, its pharaohs, its monumental architecture, but it lost its empire, its prosperity, its position as a great power. It became a regional kingdom again, important but no longer dominant, hanging on while the world it had known disintegrated around it, and perhaps that kind of survival, that slow decline while watching everything around you fall apart, is its own kind of darkness that the survival of Egypt, diminished though it was, might give the impression that the crisis had passed, that the worst was over. But Egypt's survival was the exception, not the rule. And even Egypt itself was not done declining in the decades and centuries following Ramesses III's victories. Egypt weakened from within in ways that were perhaps even more corrosive than external invasion. Central authority, the backbone of pharaonic power for millennia, began to erode as local officials gained power at the expense of the throne. Provincial governors, temple administrators, Military commanders, these figures who were supposed to serve the pharaoh, began acting with increasing independence. They controlled local resources, commanded local loyalty, and always obey orders from the capital. The centralized system that had made Egypt so resilient was fragmenting into competing power centers. This was partly because later, pharaohs were simply less effective rulers. After Ramesses III, the succession of pharaohs, most of them also named Ramesses, confusingly grew progressively weaker. Some were children when they came to the throne. Others ruled for only brief periods. Few showed the competence or charisma needed to hold the state together during a time of crisis. When the ruler is weak, everyone else starts positioning for advantage. And that's exactly what happened in late New Kingdom Egypt. Political instability increased accordingly. Court intrigue, succession disputes, power struggles between competing factions, all of this became more common. There's even evidence of a conspiracy to assassinate Ramesses III, involving members of the royal harem and court officials. The plot failed, but the fact that it happened at all shows how fractured Egyptian politics had become. When people are willing to kill the pharaoh, the supposedly divine king, the social contract has fundamentally broken down. One of the most telling signs of decline was that tomb robberies became more common. This might seem like a minor detail, but it's actually quite significant. Royal tombs and elite burials were supposed to be sacrosanct, protected by religious prohibition and physical security. They contained enormous wealth, gold, jewelry, fine goods, but they also represented something sacred in Egyptian culture. Robbing a tomb wasn't just theft. It was sacrilege, a violation of everything Egyptian society held holy. Yet during the late New Kingdom, tomb robbery became almost endemic. Asterisk papyrus records from the period document investigations into tomb robbery rings, involving guards, officials, and workers who systematically looted the burials of previous pharaohs. People were so desperate, or the social order had broken down so completely, that they were willing to violate the dead for material gain. Externally, Egypt lost control of Canaan and Syria, the territories in the Levant that had been part of Egypt's sphere of influence for centuries. These regions had provided resources, tribute, and strategic depth. Their loss meant Egypt's borders effectively shrank back to the Nile Valley itself. The empire had contracted to just Egypt proper, and even within Egypt, control was weakening. Monument building, one of the defining characteristics of Egyptian civilization, slowed dramatically. The massive temple complexes, the grand statues, the elaborate tombs that had characterized the New Kingdom construction on this scale became rare or stopped entirely. This wasn't just about aesthetics. Monument building was how pharaohs demonstrated their power and piety, how they employed workers, how they moved resources through the economy. When monument building stops, it's a sign that the state lacks either the resources or the organizational capacity to undertake these projects. Probably both. Corruption spread within the administration like rot through timber. Officials who weren't being paid reliably found other ways to support themselves, taking bribes, embezzling funds, extorting the people they were supposed to serve. The bureaucratic system that had run Egypt with impressive efficiency for thousands of years was breaking down, becoming predatory rather than functional. When you can't trust the people administering your state, when officials are stealing rather than serving, the entire system becomes hollow. Egypt survived, but with drastically reduced international influence. The Egypt of the late New Kingdom was no longer a superpower. It was a regional kingdom, important primarily because of its historical prestige and its still considerable agricultural resources. But it wasn't shaping events anymore. It wasn't dictating terms to other nations. It was just trying to hold itself together. This slow decline led inevitably to the Third Intermediate Period. Beginning around 1070 BCE, during this era, Egypt fragmented politically. The country split between competing dynasties ruling from different cities, Tanis in the north, Thebes in the south. Foreign dynasties, including Libyan and later Nubian rulers, took control of parts of Egypt. The unified pharaonic state that had existed for over 1,000 years was broken. Egypt would eventually reunify, would even have periods of renewed strength, but it would never again be the dominant power it had been during the New Kingdom. The Bronze Age collapse hadn't destroyed Egypt, but it had permanently diminished it now. While Egypt was slowly declining and the Hittites had vanished, and Mycenaean Greece had fallen into darkness, there was one major state that experienced stress without collapse, and its survival, and more importantly, what it learned from surviving, would reshape the ancient Near East.